Thank you, everybody. I was told that I should always include an agenda slide so people know what they're in for and also whether or not they should get the hell out. So, while you guys, while you guys take a look, there will be some code in this. If you're into code, this will be a lot of fun. So, for background, I'm a security strategist for a large financial institution, and so I enjoy training and teaching people stuff. And so the research I'm going to be presenting is furthering some stuff that I learned from one of my old coworkers, Drew Bonstrom, and I've taken it a couple extra steps. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about hiding malware in Office documents, but also this will also apply to things like data exfiltration and stuff like that. So the problem that I wanted to solve was for phishing especially, and obviously we just learned a lot about profiling and that sort of stuff for figuring out what people find interesting in order for phishing to happen. One of the ways that is still really effective is Word documents. The blue teams have started to catch on, and there's getting better detection in things like FireEye. Windows Defender is, as far as I can tell, just far above pretty much all of the other antiviruses for detecting this. They keep making it harder and harder. IR teams are used to looking at these documents, and for a lot of these, they can take a quick cursory look at the contents of the macro and go, oh yeah, that's another Cobalt Strike. Oh yeah, that's another Metasploit. And so it just makes it really easy for them. And so what I wanted to figure out is, can I make it more difficult for automated tools to look at these? And the other thing I wanted to look at is, so there are solutions out there to help. And so I went through and I started looking at some of these, and I'll have a resource for some of these at the end. And what I found is that many of them are detected, and they're being detected pretty quickly. So how can we improve these? So the current things that I'm gonna mention, Cobalt Strike. How many people here have used Cobalt Strike? Okay, so a lot more people are using Cobalt Strike. It has the ability to build Word and Excel macros, and it's pretty decent, but it doesn't really do anything to hide itself. It's pretty much straightforward. Metasploit does Office macros that work for a couple of different types. Empire, I want to especially call out Empire. They don't just have Office macros, they have Mac support. So if you're fishing on Macs, you know, and there's not a lot of other security things there, give Empire a try. And so one of the ones that I came across that has been pretty effective in the past has been Cactus Torch. And for those that don't know what Cactus Torch is, it's a way of embedding a COM object into a Word document and then using that COM object to run your code. And so it's a little bit more, I guess, effective than a lot of the others, because it's harder to pick up on. But since it became popular, a lot of the antivirus vendors have signatures for it. And so if you're interested in these attacks, and there's a number of others, at ired.team, there's an entire list of different attack vectors. So what's our problem? Most of these techniques get caught or blocked. And one of the ones that was one of my favorites was the remote remote document templates, where you could actually give somebody a normal Word document, make a malicious macro, and then put it on a remote HTTP server. So that got patched earlier this year. And so Microsoft is now starting to aggressively go after these things. And so that is making it a little bit harder. Defender is getting better at detecting these. So Defender now has some behavior analytics for things happening out of Office documents that's able to catch some of this stuff. Symantec and McAfee, your mileage may vary. So sometimes I see things getting caught that I'm really surprised about, and other things that I think should be absolutely blatantly malicious. When they looks at it, it's like a whatever. So for instance, I just tried Metasploit through Veil the other day, and it was like, go for it. And so, you know, the stuff that I'm going to be talking about is for when these things don't work. But like I said, IR can sort through these really quickly. One of the ones that I look at when I'm looking at my payloads to see what is really out there is OLE VBA. And OLE VBA is a Python tool that will dump the macro out of an Office document and then give you some basic analysis. It'll tell you, how many base 64 strings it sees, whether or not it sees any kind of interesting encodings and that sort of stuff. One of the things that I've noticed when I've been looking at things of mine that I've gotten caught and things that haven't gotten caught is it seems to correlate with FireEye a little bit, the number of things in that list versus whether or not it makes it through. So I don't know if like there's anything besides circumstantial stuff there, but it seems like when my list is small, everything is happy, and when it's not, I'm going to have a bad time. So one of the other things that has a lot of potential is stomping. So stomping is basically when you have a macro, it's actually kept in two places. It's kept in bytecode and it's kept in text. And if you have a document that was built on the exact same platform that you are going after, you can get rid of that text and it will still run. And when somebody opens the macro, it'll just be blank. But unless you're really good at your OSCent or you're going against a small enough company that they're predictable, most big companies, you know, even though they have patching, who knows what you're actually going to get. And so it's kind of tough, but that works. One of the tools to do this that's pretty effective is Evil Clippy. If you guys haven't checked out Evil Clippy, check that out. So the other thing is people with even basic EDR are looking for PowerShell. And a lot of the time people are running these macros and then are just trying to shell out PowerShell stuff. And it's completely obvious when it happens. So one of the things that I've been doing with this is going with Cactus Torch. And the reason is Cactus Torch doesn't have to shell out PowerShell. So even with obfuscation, most of these macros, it's really easy to tell what they are. Part of it is because even with obfuscation, it looks like just pages and pages of gobbledygook because your payload has to be big enough to be in there. And it's like, why is all this base 64 trash in the middle of this thing? So with Cactus Torch, like I said, it actually uses a COM object. The stock macro is detected by some stuff, but we have opposable digits, so we got tools. And so this was my starting point, right? So let's take a quick look at how to actually do this with Cobalt Strike and Cactus Torch to start off with. So the first thing we do is by grabbing the Cactus Torch Git repo, it's got a couple of things in it. One is it has a CNA file for Cobalt Strike. And when we load this in, you basically just click load, and then you go to your file, and you load in the CNA file. When you load in the CNA file, you'll get a new option under attack. Once you see it loaded there, if you go up under attacks, you can say host Cactus Torch payload. And so some of this stuff here, URI path doesn't really matter for this because we're going to use a stageless payload. One of the differences between a staged payload and a stageless payload is a stageless payload keeps all of the stuff in one place. We're going to create a VBA macro. And one of the other things you saw there was the run DLL32. When this actually spawns, it's going to process hollow run DLL32 and shove our stuff into that because it's not PowerShell. So now we open up Word and we go under View and go to Macros. And so we're going to just create a fake name. One of the things we want to make sure we do is don't contaminate our template. We're going to go to the actual Word document itself and create, and then we just paste this guy in. So one of the things you'll notice is that this is a ton of code, and that doesn't look malicious at all, right? That looks, everybody's macros look exactly like that. Yeah, the other thing that you'll notice is like things are called binary and code. And so, it doesn't even try, right? So here what you can see is actually allocating this as a stream, deserializing hex code, and then it's creating the object, creating the instance, and then you see o.flame, which is a method in the Cactus Torch COM object. And so all of those are really easy for antivirus to pick up. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that and we're going to save it. So when we save it, by default, you have docx files. Docx files are really easy to look into because they're basically zip files. So we're actually going to change this to just a doc file. And the doc file supports macros without having to have any kind of special extension. And so it tends to make it through things like FireEye a little bit more easily. So now when we look at this with OLE VBA, you can see my sweet typing skills. When we look at this with OA VBA, one of the things that we're going to see is that there's just tons of stuff that it finds. Pages and pages of things that look funny. So you see here, base 64 strings, hex data, the actual code comments, all of that sort of stuff, all of these DLLs. And so unless you have some sort of severely challenged incident responder, this should be completely obvious what it is, right? And so if you give your incident responder this and they can't figure it out, then you need a new incident responder. So now when we look at this, we see all of these sweet macros: auto open, workbook open, which some of those are for Word, some of those are for Excel. And so that's also a dead giveaway. And then the one called run, is pretty special too. So now when we run this, we get our beacon back. In order to run this, I had to turn off Defender hard. Otherwise, Defender it didn't even let me get close. So, at this point, we have our shell, and that was successful. So that was our starting point, but we can do better. We certainly can't do worse. So one of the things that I wanted to look at is what hidey holes can we put this stuff in, right? So some of the things that came up, metadata. Metadata is a nice place to store stuff. Unfortunately, you can look at it through the GUI. You can look at the document properties, you can see all that. So again, incident responders, if they're half decent, they're going to right click and look to see what is there, or just dump it with a tool and it's going to be obvious. Image alt tags. This is one that I don't think people have looked at a lot, and it's kind of neat. The problem is you have to dump a bunch of images in there because the alt tags have a maximum of 255 characters. So if you have a couple K payload, that's a lot of images. Anyway, so the other thing is you can always hide the images to limit visibility. So maybe that doesn't matter as much, but you end up with just this huge document file. And so the other thing is document text. And so that is okay. You can make it really small, make it white, and maybe people won't see it. But as soon as you actually dump the document with any tools, it's completely obvious. So one of the things that I wanted to look at was how do we hide this stuff so that it's a little bit easier. So my favorite right now is document variables. For people that may not be familiar with document variables are different than metadata variables. Document variables are there for programmers who want to be able to store some information inside the document. The only place that you can see them is through the macro interface, or if you pull up the raw XML. You can't see it via the GUI at all. When you save to non-word formats, it just strips these out. So if somebody were to dump this with a tool, convert it to a text file, something like that, it just disappears. So nobody will be able to tell what's there. And so, like I said, XML and macro is really the only way to see it. For Word 97, there isn't a way to see it that I can find programmatically. In order to actually see it, you have to convert it to a docx file and dump it out if you want to actually look at the pieces there without using macros. So let's take a look about what this looks like in Cobalt Strike. So the tool that I created for this right now is being called Better Torch. I'm going to release it later this weekend. It still needs a little bit of love, but basically in our case, we're going to load the Better Torch module. And I've made some changes, and I'll talk about those as we go along. So here we see the host Better Torch payload. One of the things you'll notice down at the bottom is your options. You have Word and Excel. It has a little fewer options up front. So you have the Word or Excel there. You need a little bit different strategy for each. We're going to go after the Excel in a minute. And so basically you do the same thing. You've got clipboard. So now we take that, we go back into our Word document, and we're going to go back into our macros, and we're going to create our macro again. And so this has it situated a little bit differently so that we can optimize how small it is. So we just create our placeholder again, copy all of our stuff, and paste it. So you'll notice that there's still all of this there, right? But we only need it for a minute as we put the things in the document variables. So here, one of the things that we're going to do is, because I am lazy, I'm I am going to be using some of the scripting, Microsoft scripting interface. So we're going to add in the scripting interface so that I can use dictionaries instead of having to use one of VBA's data structures, because it turns out that that is a horrible language. And so anyway, now when we look at this, we see two things. We see delete me setup, which will run. And once it's run, we can delete all of that code. So now we can just go in and delete me setup. And then when we go in, we can edit this guy. And instead of including all three, we can pick just the one that we want. And so for this one, we're going to delete that and do the auto open. The workbook open and the other auto opener for Excel. And so that is the only one for Word. So we do this. And so now if you look, you're limited to a whole lot less code. You can look over at the scroll bar on the right and see. So now we're using these active document variables. And all the things are randomized. We still have some of the create objects and that sort of stuff. And we still have the o.flame. So if we were to change our com object, then we can change the name of that o.flame. And we're going to talk about that in a minute to hide that. But unfortunately, unless you change the com object, that has to persist. So now all that we have is auto open. So let's take a look at this. Let's save this guy out. When we run him, we should see our connection back. So yay, that's good. And so now when we save this guy, we'll save it as a doc file again instead of a docx. We'll see what the OLE VBA shows up. And so you can save this as a doc file, but or a docm file, but you can't save it as a docx file. Docx files won't actually run the macro. So now when we do this, we see we're down to two things. We see the auto exec, auto open, and suspicious create object. Now, for people who may have looked at a lot of macros, there are a lot of reasons to include create object. A lot of things that, for instance, pull data off the web or do anything that requires a .NET library will have create object. And so FireEye, for instance, won't fire on that. It's not suspicious enough. And auto open on itself isn't suspicious enough. So this will make it through FireEye, and it will make it through most of the antiviruses and most of the ingress things. The way that you launch the com object, depending on the settings for your Defender, it may or may not be seen. By default, I was able to get this running and it not be seen. So one of the things I also wanted to do is give people a chance for questions before we move on to the next thing. Does anybody have questions before we move on to the next part? Yep.
Which version of Windows Defender? So this Windows Defender and this Windows Defender ATP?
It is not the ATP. It is standard Windows Defender. It has enough instrumentation to be able to tell when. So what it saw was the process hollowing function of Cactus Torch. If you change the method, it is less effective. So one of the things that I'm working on for the future is basically extending the com object to do some more stuff. And I'll talk about that some more in the future. But just standard Windows Defender will pick it up. Yep. Again, it depends on what method you use. Process hollowing is pretty obvious. There are some other methods that don't get picked up quite as easily. And also EDR tools tend to pay attention in the first couple seconds and look at things that are happening in response. So I'll talk about, remind me if I don't talk about that in a minute, but there's what comes next, auto open is not the way to do this. Auto open is more likely to get caught. Forcing user interaction is the way around this. Any other questions before we move on and talk about Excel a little bit? Okay. So Excel documents. Excel documents don't have document variables, which made me very sad. And we hadn't been doing a lot of fishing with Excel documents, but when we decided we needed to, all of the things that I tried went horribly. So this is going to be a little bit my experience with that. Metadata, again, can be seen through the GUI. Image alt tags. There aren't a lot of people that toss a lot of images in spreadsheets, but you can still use that. And sheet text. So sheet text can be hidden, but it's easily recovered and converted to text. So one of the things, as I started researching, I found out that there's actually 3 different visible states in Excel. There's a visible, which is visible in the GUI, hidden, which is unhideable in the GUI, but then there's extremely hidden, which is, I guess, the Red Bull of like hiding. So extremely hidden, you can't unhide anywhere except for from the macro side. You can change that there. But if you convert this document to say PDF, extremely hidden stays hidden. So if you convert this to anything else, it's still hidden. So since we don't have document variables, extremely hidden was our way to go with this. So you can put up to 32K in a cell, so that's not horrible. The Cactus Torch payload itself for the COM object fits easily in 32K, and splitting the Cobalt Strike payload or any other payload up into 32K chunks isn't actually that bad. The problem is Excel has some quirks, and if anybody's ever worked with Excel, you know that putting certain special characters at the front of fields means certain things, like plus sign means add this, or an equal sign means something very specific. And so that is cool and all, but base 64 has plus signs and equal signs. So you have to give it a little bit of attention to make sure you're not doing something stupid along the way. So let's take a look at how this works under Excel. It's very similar. We load up our better torch. We'll generate our payload. We'll select Excel, and we'll do the same thing. One of the things I'll mention is one of the things that you saw in here was the regsurf32 as the binary that we're injecting into. A lot of things are looking at that right now. You can actually use any binary that is in system32. Let me pause this one second. You can actually use any binary that's in system32 and the 64. And the reason it does that is it will make it platform independent. It looks to see things in both of those places. There are a handful of binaries that exist in both places. So pick one of those other binaries. There's a number of pieces of documentation about how to pick ones that are good and less likely to be detected. Run DLL is your worst idea, basically. So by default, you know, your mileage may vary. Picking others will give you some improvements. And so, yeah, basically all that does is the binary you're injecting into. And so that keeps you from not having to switch between 32 and 64-bit. So here what we see is we have basically the same stuff. We have the scripting dictionary again. We're going to have to add back in the stuff for the scripting dictionary. So we go back to our references, we add back in that. And we're going to basically do the same thing. One of the things that we'll see along the way is I'm going to show you guys how to fix when you hit one of those equal sign errors. So here we have our delete me setup. So we go to that function and we run it, and we see this awesome out of memory. What does that even mean? Out of memory for what? So what out of memory in this case actually means is it just tried to do a computation with that. And obviously with all of those division and plus signs and everything else, it was just like, you know what, screw it, I'm going home. So now we have to go back to the top of this, and we see that it starts with a plus sign. So our elite selves, we delete the plus sign from there and move it to the next line, and like magic, it works. So now we do that. Now the problem is because our sheet 2, cleverly called BOXQ3, already exists and is very hidden, in order to delete it, we have to make it visible again. And so once we've made it visible again, after we stop the debugger, because you also can't do it while the debugger is running. So after we do that, we set it back to visible, and then we can come and delete it. You can see kind of what this actually looks like if you were to actually see that here. So now we come back, we go back to our delete me setup, and we can run this guy again. And now we see our sheet 3. When we look at our sheet 3, it's very hidden. And so now we can delete our delete me setup and move on with our lives. So we also need to do our renaming. And so here we can choose auto open or workbook open. And so they basically do the same thing, but are called at different points. So depending on how this is rendered, auto open or workbook open will be more effective. And there's entire like Microsoft articles that are not that interesting to me on the difference. And so I didn't pay a lot of attention to just know that it's different, and the way that I wanted to do it was auto open. So now we can delete our delete me setup. We just have our auto open. And again, we can save this as a Word 97 macro. So when we look at our Cobalt Strike, it's not there. When we run it, it goes, yay shells. Okay, so we now have our shell back. And so if we want to look at what this looks like in OLE VBA, we can go back and we can save this again, and we're going to save it as the 97 format. And so, again, you see basically the same thing. This one has a couple of things. It has create object and it has hex strings. So the hex encoded strings were detected. One of the things that if you actually look at it, it turns out to be nothing. We can fix this by changing the length of some of our variable names. If it actually hits this, if you just rerun the module and it randomizes it again, it'll get rid of the hex strings. It just so happens that if you hit a randomized string that only has lowercase between like 0 to 9 and then A to F in it, it's like, oh, that's hex. So just rerun it again and it fixes it. And so now we have a document that we can use. So again, if you run this again, that'll go away, and you'll only end up with those two, the auto open and create object again. Before I start talking some more about improving evasion, anybody have questions on the Excel piece? Yes, sir.
Yeah, could you use a different encoding technique when you encode still has equal sign pluses? Could you just use something other than base 64?
Sure. And so the thing for this is it is not because it was using base 64. This has everything to do with my crappy random string generator, not the actual content of the payload. So let me figure out how to put this. If I cared more where I didn't just rerun it, then I would write a better random string generator. But I didn't. When I make this public, I welcome all of the pull requests. Yeah, anybody's welcome to fix my janky code if they would like. And the first thing is probably better randomizers. Right now, it's basically just looping through all of the characters that are valid for base 64. Well, all the characters that are valid for VBA. This is another interesting little caveat. Not all characters are valid for VBA. So you can't start variable names with numbers. I haven't accounted for that either. So if you get a thing that has a number up front, just rerun it and it'll be better next time. So yeah, maybe one day. Any other questions? Yep.
So you said this was now bypassing FireEye and most AV. Did your incident responders bypass them as well? Did they think this was suspicious at all?
Well,
Did they even look at it? Were they depending on the tools?
They were depending on the tools, and I will say that the quality of your fish will drastically change the outcome of this. So our ones that have been really poor fishes, they gave it an additional look. The ones that were really good fishes, people claim credit for. We've had things that didn't get responded to because they were really good-looking fishes, and so all that sort of stuff is kind of interesting. And the ones that were really bad-looking, they were like, "This looks exactly like a fish. Even if this document isn't malicious, just be gone." Any other questions? Okay, so improving evasion. So some of you guys asked about some other things that we can do here, so I'm going to talk about some of these. One is add encryption. So for adding the encryption, One of the places that I'm looking at doing this is actually in the COM object. So we can use AES encryption and then base the key off of environmental variables. Most people that have FireEye deployed don't have their corporate image sitting inside FireEye. So if something will only run in the corporate image, it means it can't ever decrypt in FireEye. And most people don't do their instant response on a imaged machine for their environment. So again, they will have a bad time. Keying off environment variables is another one. And so things that like host name, domain name, the domain SID's a really good one. It's hard for people to figure out if they don't know what they're looking for. So if you can include something programmatic there, it's nice. Username patterns, if your company has a very specific username pattern, then that's a good one. And like I said, it's nice for FireEye sandboxes and a lot of the other sandboxes because they don't know anything about your environment, and so they typically won't run when you detonate them. Customizing Cactus Torch is the way that I have been going. I've been slowly adding to my Cactus Torch COM object to include encryption, include randomizers, things to split stuff up more easily, so that I can do a lot of the stuff that I'm currently doing in Cobalt Strike inside my actual Word document macro, so that I can use Payload from anywhere. I don't have to just use Cobalt Strike. There's a couple other C2 frameworks that are coming out that show some promise, and so want to be able to do as much of that in the actual COM object as I can. And for anybody who hasn't written COM objects, they aren't like normal C# code. They're like C# code that hates you. So like if you're like, I would like to use this data structure, that will be the data structure that COM does not support. I had to call in a friend to make some of this work because I was like, this doesn't make any sense. And he's like, yeah, COM objects don't make sense. You just have to roll with it. And so I felt a little bit better about that. But yeah, so let's take a look at how to rebuild the COM object so that you can do it yourself. If you want to add anything in, you have to use Visual Studio for this. So basically you just load it up. We're going to start off with .NET to JScript. .NET to JScript is how the COM object is actually encoded and put into the Cactus Torch file. And so we're going to start off by building this. We'll just build it, and then we'll copy the release version of .NET to JScript into the directory that has our COM object in it. So we're going to copy that guy here. And so next thing we can do is we can actually use CSC, which is a command line C compiler for .NET that we can use. We're going to compile this into a library. And so in the .cs directory, there's this cleverly named test class.cs that they stole and extended from .NET to JavaScript or .NET to JScript. So now we have this test class.dll. So now we need to turn the test class.dll into that hex object. So what we're going to do is we're going to take .NET to JScript, and we're going to go ahead and tell it the language we're going to use is VBA. We're going to go ahead and tell it what files to output to, and so cactus.vba, and then we're going to give it the test class. And it's going to say that doesn't work because it's called Cactus Torch, but it was built into test class.dll. So I renamed mine, so it's not called Cactus Torch anymore. Now it's Squirtle. Lol, because shells. Anyway, for any Pokemon fans. Anyway, so then it poops it back out into all of the hex stuff and then a bunch of stuff we don't care about. So what we would do from here is we would steal that hex code and we would copy it into our CNA file in order to be able to just use all of this. And so the things that you have to change when you rename the class, I strongly recommend you call the actual executing method something besides flame, because that is something that's triggering off of signatures. You can call it literally anything that you want. And the only thing is that is the one thing that you can't obfuscate. That has to just be. So you can create a random name that looks obfuscated, and then it is what it is. I recommend not run malware or something like that, or you have just wasted your time. or not if you're just having fun with your incident responders. But that's really the only piece there. So looking ahead, one of the things that I would love is some collaboration on this. I have some ideas. I'm probably not going to make the C# stuff that I'm working on public right away, because people are stupid and submit it to VirusTotal, and then I'm sad. And so if this is something where somebody would like to collaborate, I'll have my contact information at the end and people can chat with me. So some of the things that I'm adding are different methods to actually execute code, some different ways to hide it, some built-in things to pull for some of the environment variables and stuff like that to make it a little bit easier to hide it. And so, one of the other things that I wanted to do was some unmanaged PowerShell. The COM object, you can actually load PowerShell into itself, and then you're just loading unmanaged PowerShell from within the Word document and doing that. And EDRs may see you loading unmanaged PowerShell, but there's actually PowerShell extensions for Word, and so they may not be paying a whole lot of attention to that because you can actually do some PowerShell in Word anyway. And so encryption's good, I hear. So, the last one is additional hidey holes. Obviously everybody knows about document variables now. So looking at some additional places to hide it, some of the things that been looking at is actually what we can do with the document structure itself so that we can pull things back out of the document itself that may not be visible and some things like that. Last thing I wanted to show you guys before we do some more questions is forensics. So if we wanted to look at this, like I said, the doc file, there's not a whole lot you can do to get it out of this. But if you suspect that something's malicious, you can always turn it into a docx file, rename the docx to a zip, extract it, and the document variables all live in settings.xml. So settings.xml, when you look at it, it's usually pretty small. When you start putting all of this crap in here, you start seeing all these docvar fields, and these docvar name equals blah, and there's our base64 code. So if we wanted to do some more trolling, obviously we can encrypt that and then they can't do anything with it. But this is the way that if somebody wanted to put this back together manually without running this through a debugger or something else, they can extract all of these out of here with their awesome Perl skills or whatever people use these days. And then go through and match it up with what's in the actual code. Other than that, EDR and that sort of stuff is another way to do it. One of the ways, going back to your EDR question, one of the things for EDR, I suggest putting form fields in and of some kind. Sign up for our newsletter, just type in your email and hit here, register for a free puppy, whatever. If people are mashing buttons, which is especially common in Excel, then EDR is like, oh, you meant to do that. And so it's much less likely to fire for those sort of things. So that is one of the things that I found. Also, if you have to do mouse clicks, it's another way to avoid detection on detonation of malware in something like FireEye or a sandbox, that sort of stuff. So I recommend not using auto open. It's also another line that doesn't show up, but instead bind a function to something inside the actual doc itself, and you'll be better off. With that, I'm going to go ahead and throw some thanks out. Drew Bonstrom is who originally showed me the document variables, and a lot of the stuff was based off of, and smart guy, and so wanted to give him thanks. Walmart Labs. So Walmart Labs has some really cool stuff that they've talked about, including one of them is called, I think it's called VBA seismograph, which is a way to tell if people are using a lot of the techniques from Evil Clippy within a document. So if you're an incident responder and you haven't looked at their stuff, go take a look. It's some really great material to kind of sort through some of this. Also for Evil Clippy, go check out the techniques there, and also the redteam.me site, which has lots of these little things that you can do. Like I said, some of them will work, some of them won't, but knowing what your options are is always a good place to be. So if you want to work on this stuff, feel free to reach out and contact me. Hopefully folks have some more questions. So give us a minute for questions. Anybody got anything? Yes, sir.
So moving to encryption, a lot of people are doing that to avoid, simulation, et cetera. But then you're subject to entropy calculations, and a lot of people are treating things with high entropy or incompressibility as suspicious because normal stuff isn't. So are you afraid of that, or what's your response?
So the question was, aren't you afraid of it being identified because of entropy when you're using encryption? And so the big thing is most of the tools that are looking at this can't actually pull this data out. So really it's just to mess with the responders, and the automated tools will never see it anyway. I think that for some things that is definitely a possibility, but I think that for this specific technique, I'm not worrying too much about it. Other questions? Last chance. Okay. Thank you guys very much for your time. I really appreciate it.